At 33 years old, Clara Doyle stood in the dust of a road that no longer belonged to her, holding a carpet bag that contained everything she owned in the world. It was her brother-in-law, Silas Doyle, who had put her there, standing on the porch of the homestead she had helped build with her own 2 hands, telling her in a voice flat as a shovel blade that the land was his now, that a widow with no children had no claim under the law, and that she would do well to be gone before nightfall. What she had left, after the wagon and the tools, and even her late husband's Bible, had been claimed as family property, was $14 folded into a handkerchief, and a walk of 11 miles into the town of Ashwater Basin, Arizona Territory, in the spring of 1889. It was there, at a county tax auction held in the shade of the feed store awning, that she raised her hand for a crumbling adobe chapel that had sat abandoned on the desert flats for 11 years, a building so forgotten that even the auctioneer laughed before he took her $6. "Take it home," the men smirked, tipping their hats in mockery as she signed her name to the deed, certain she had spent the last of her dignity on a pile of sand and broken beams. None of them knew that beneath the altar of that ruined chapel rested something sealed away by hands long dead, a secret that would not only restore what had been stolen from an entire town, but would answer a question about Clara's own family that she had never thought to ask. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Doyle. If you have ever been told that what you carry is worthless, that the thing you cling to has no value to anyone but you, tell us in the comments. We would love to hear how you proved them wrong. Clara had not always been a woman who counted coins by candlelight. She had been raised the daughter of a stonemason in a modest house in Independence, Missouri, where her father, Thomas Reyes, taught her that a wall built badly would fall no matter how pretty the mortar looked on the day it was laid, and a wall built with patience would outlast the men who mocked its slowness. Her mother, Margaret, was a quilter and a healer of small things, burns, fevers, broken hearts, and it was from her that Clara learned the particular stubbornness of a woman who refuses to let a thing be thrown away simply because someone else has decided it is finished. When Clara was 19, she married Daniel Doyle, a quiet young man with sun-browned hands and a laugh that came rarely, but meant everything when it did, and together they had followed the promise of cheap land west, first to Kansas, and then, in 1881, to the edges of Ashwater Basin, where Daniel's older brother Silas had already staked a claim on good bottomland near the wash. For 8 years, Clara and Daniel worked a smaller parcel beside it, raising goats and a modest orchard of stone fruit, and though the land was hard and the water scarcer than promised, they built something together that felt, to Clara, like a life worth having. It was during those years that Clara became known, quietly, without ever intending it, as a woman who could fix what others gave up on. She mended saddles that saddlers refused to touch. She revived a well that the town blacksmith swore was dry for good. She took in an orphaned lamb so weak the shepherd had left it for the coyotes, and raised it into the healthiest ewe in the basin. Daniel used to tease her, saying she had a gift for hearing the small voice inside a broken thing that said, "Not yet, I am not finished." She never thought much of the compliment at the time. She only knew that she hated waste, hated the easy cruelty of writing something off simply because it was inconvenient to save. It was a value her mother had planted in her early, and it had taken deep root, the way a mesquite tree sends its taproot 40 feet down to water no one else believes is there. She did not know yet that this single quality, her refusal to see worthlessness where others saw only trash, would one day be the very thing that saved a town. Daniel died in the autumn of 1888, crushed in a rockslide while helping timber a mine shaft 2 counties over, chasing wages after a drought had ruined that year's fruit crop. Clara buried him beneath a cottonwood on the land they had cleared together, and for 3 months she held on to the property through sheer will, working the goats herself, mending fences with her own hands, refusing every offer of pity from the town. But the law of the territory did not care for a widow's will. The parcel had never been formally recorded in her name. Daniel, trusting and unhurried in the way of a man who believes he has decades left, had never filed the paper that would have protected her. And when Silas Doyle produced an old family agreement, claiming the land reverted to him upon his brother's death without heirs, the circuit judge, more interested in supper than justice, upheld it in less time than it takes to read a Bible verse. Silas did not even wait for the ink to dry before he began moving his own herd onto Clara's orchard. He stood on what had been her porch, arms crossed, and told her plainly that a woman alone was a liability to the family name, and that she should be grateful he was letting her leave with her health. She left with $14, a carpet bag of clothes, her mother's sewing kit, and a small tin locket containing a curl of Daniel's hair. She walked the 11 miles to Ashwater Basin, with the desert sun laying its full, unblinking weight across her shoulders, and by the time she reached the edge of town, her feet were raw, and her resolve had hardened into something colder and more useful than grief. She did not yet know what she would do. She only knew she would not beg, and she would not go back to Silas Doyle on her knees. It was in this state, exhausted, proud, and entirely out of options, that she wandered into the shade of the feed store just as the county tax auction was beginning, and heard the auctioneer, a portly man named Chester Bramwell, reading off a list of forfeited properties that included, near the bottom, in a tone that suggested even he found it embarrassing to mention, 1 abandoned chapel structure and half-acre lot, Widow's Rest Road, condition poor, back taxes $6 even. Clara had passed that chapel 100 times in her years in the basin. It sat 2 miles outside town, on a spur of hardpan desert, a squat adobe building with a bell tower that had lost its bell decades before anyone could remember. Its roof caved in on one corner, its windows long since robbed of glass by boys with slingshots. It had been built, according to old-timers, sometime before the town itself existed, by a small band of settlers and a wandering priest, whose name nobody quite agreed on, and it had been abandoned since a flash flood in 1878 had cracked its foundation and driven off what little congregation remained. Rattlesnakes were said to den beneath its floor. Children dared each other to run inside and touch the altar and run back out again. It was, by any sane measure, worth exactly nothing, a fact the men gathered under the awning confirmed with their laughter the moment Clara Doyle, dust-covered and hollow-eyed, raised her hand and said, in a voice steadier than she felt, "I'll take it." Chester Bramwell blinked at her, as though she had spoken in tongues. "You're bidding on the chapel?" he asked, and when she nodded, he shrugged and said the $6 was hers if she wanted it. God help her. It was then that one of the men near the rail, a broad-shouldered rancher named Otis Pruitt, whose family owned the largest spread in the basin, and who had never in his life needed to consider the price of anything, let out a short laugh, and called across the crowd, "Take it home then, if you're so fond of snakes." The men around him chuckled along, and Clara felt the heat rise in her face, not from shame, but from something harder and more resolved. She paid her $6 in coin from the handkerchief, signed the deed Chester slid toward her, and walked the 2 miles out to Widow's Rest Road, with the paper folded against her chest like a shield, telling herself that a roof, even a broken one, was still a roof, and that she would rather sleep among snakes she could see than among men who smiled while they robbed her blind. The chapel, up close, was worse than she remembered, and somehow, in its ruin, more beautiful than she expected. The adobe walls, thick as a man's forearm, had cracked in a jagged seam along the north side, but still stood true and square, built by hands that understood, as her father had taught her, that patience outlasts mockery. The roof had fallen through above the old choir loft, letting in a shaft of desert light that fell directly onto the altar, a simple slab of stone, waist-high, set into a low platform at the front of the nave. Dust lay thick over everything, and pack rats had made nests in the corners, and the whole place smelled of sun-baked clay and old, dry silence. But when Clara stepped through the doorway that first evening, carpet-bag still in hand, something in her chest loosened for the first time in weeks. It was hers. No one could take it from her by a lawyer's trick or a brother's smirk, because no one else had wanted it in the first place. She spread her shawl on the cleanest patch of floor she could find, ate the last of her bread, and slept that night beneath a broken roof with more peace than she had known in months. It was on her 3rd day of clearing debris, sweeping years of sand and rat droppings from the nave, hauling fallen roof beams out into the yard, scrubbing the old stone floor with water hauled from the town well, that Clara noticed something odd about the altar itself. It sat slightly askew from the wall behind it, a gap of perhaps 4 inches that seemed unintentional, as though the platform beneath it had shifted at some point, or been built that way on purpose and forgotten. She knelt to examine it more closely, running her fingers along the base, and felt beneath a skin of dust and dried mud, a seam in the stonework that did not match the rest of the floor, a rectangular outline, precise and deliberate, unlike the rough natural cracking everywhere else in the building. Her father's training rose up in her without her even summoning it. A wall, or a floor, built badly falls apart at random. A floor, built on purpose to hide something, falls apart in exactly the place its maker intended. She fetched the small iron pry bar she had found among the fallen beams, worked it into the seam, and after nearly an hour of careful, sweat-soaked effort, felt the stone slab shift and lift. Beneath it was a shallow stone-lined cavity, dry as the desert above it, containing a tin document box no larger than a bread box, its surface dulled by age, but its seams still tight enough to have kept out the dust of 11 decades. Clara sat back on her heels in the fading light, her heart beating hard against her ribs, and for a long moment simply stared at it, half afraid that opening it would somehow undo the fragile peace she had only just begun to feel in this place. When she finally worked the rusted latch free, what she found inside was not gold, not silver, not the buried treasure a more foolish woman might have hoped for. It was paper, a thick bundle of it, folded letters and a leather-bound ledger, all remarkably preserved in the dry desert air, and pressed between the pages of the ledger, a small silver medallion engraved with a dove, and the words Fons Vitae, the spring of life. The ledger, written in a careful, aging hand, belonged to a man named Father Marcos Alvarado, who had founded the chapel in 1841, alongside a small band of settler families, among them a stonemason named Elias Reyes and his wife Dolores, names that struck Clara like a struck bell, for Reyes had been her own father's family name, carried west a generation before by an uncle she had only ever heard mentioned in passing at her mother's table. The ledger described, in patient and loving detail, how the chapel had been built directly atop a natural spring, a rare and precious vein of sweet water beneath the hardpan desert, and how Father Marcos and the founding families had made a covenant, written and signed by all of them, that the spring beneath the chapel would forever remain free and open to any traveler or settler who needed it, administered not by any one family, but held in trust by the chapel itself, its waters a shared inheritance belonging to the whole basin. It was, the ledger said, their small miracle in a hard land, water enough, if properly managed, to sustain the entire valley through even the driest years, a gift they had chosen to protect from any single family's greed by consecrating it to the chapel's care rather than any private deed. Clara read late into the night by the light of a tallow candle, and as she worked through the letters that followed, dated across the 1850s and 1860s, some in Father Marcos's hand, others from settlers thanking him for water drawn during a terrible drought in 1863, she began to understand something that made her hands tremble on the brittle paper. The spring the founders had protected was the very same underground water source that fed, decades later, and miles downstream, the deep well that the Pruitt family now controlled entirely, charging every rancher and farmer in Ashwater Basin a yearly fee for access that Otis Pruitt's father had begun collecting sometime in the 1870s, after the chapel's flood-damaged foundation and the flight of its congregation left no one to remember, let alone enforce, the old covenant. The Pruitts had not stolen the water through violence or forgery. They had simply been the ones left standing when everyone who remembered its true purpose had died, moved on, or forgotten, and they had built, on the town's collective amnesia, a quiet and profitable monopoly that Clara now held the paper to unmake. She did not sleep again that night. She sat with the ledger open on her knees, the silver medallion cool in her palm, and thought of Silas Doyle's smirk and Otis Pruitt's laughter, and the $14 that had once been the whole of her worldly worth, and felt something settle into place inside her that was not quite anger and not quite joy, but a fierce, clear-eyed sense of purpose. This was not a treasure to be hoarded or sold to the highest bidder. It was, exactly as Father Marcos had written, a covenant, and covenants, her mother had always told her, were not broken merely because the people who remembered them had grown old and died. They were broken only when the living chose to forget them. Clara Doyle did not intend to be one of the living who forgot. The following weeks were not easy ones. Word travels fast in a small basin town, and it did not take long for whispers to reach Otis Pruitt that the widow squatting in the old chapel had found something in the ruins. No one knew quite what, only that she had begun asking pointed questions at the county records office about old water rights and original land surveys, and that she had visited the aging territorial clerk, a stooped and careful man named Julius Farrow, 3 times in a single week. Otis Pruitt was not a man accustomed to being questioned. His family had held the deep well and its water fee for going on 15 years, had built the largest cattle operation in 3 counties on the strength of that control, and he did not intend to see it threatened by a widow who had bought a snake-infested ruin for the price of a good hat. He came to the chapel himself one afternoon, his horse kicking up dust on the road, and stood in the doorway Clara had spent a week repairing, his shadow falling long across the swept stone floor, and told her, not unkindly, but not gently either, that whatever she thought she had found out there, she would do well to keep it to herself, unless she wanted to discover just how difficult life could be for a woman alone in Ashwater Basin. Clara did not raise her voice, and she did not lower her eyes. She told him she intended to bring her findings before the town council at the next public meeting, and that he was welcome to attend and make whatever case he wished. Otis Pruitt left without another word, but within days Clara began to feel the pressure of his displeasure in smaller ways. The general store suddenly out of the nails she needed to repair the roof, a promised load of lumber from the mill that never arrived, an unfamiliar coldness from townsfolk who had once at least nodded to her in passing. Silas Doyle, hearing of the trouble, rode out once to gloat, telling her that this was what came of a woman meddling in matters better left to men, and that she would find no allies in Ashwater Basin when the Pruitts decided to make her life impossible. It would have been easy, in those weeks, for Clara to lose her nerve, to fold the ledger back into its tin box, bury it again beneath the altar, and simply live out a quiet, unremarkable life in the chapel she had claimed. But she thought of Father Marcos's careful hand, of the settlers who had signed their names beneath his, trusting that someone, someday, would honor what they had built, and she found she could not set that trust down, even when it would have been so much easier. She spent her evenings by candlelight, copying the covenant and the surrounding letters into a clean, careful hand of her own, cross-referencing them against the survey records Julius Farrow allowed her to examine, until she had assembled a case that even a skeptical council could not easily dismiss. A signed covenant, dated and witnessed, establishing the spring beneath the chapel as common trust water, a chain of letters proving the spring's connection to the deep well the Pruitts now controlled, and, most damning of all, an 1874 territorial survey map, dusty and forgotten in Farrow's back room, that showed the underground channel running directly from the chapel's foundation to the well itself, undeniable in ink and measurement. She requested a hearing before the town council, and though several members initially balked at giving a stage to what they assumed was a grieving widow's fancy, Julius Farrow, a man who had quietly resented the Pruitt monopoly for years, but lacked the standing to challenge it himself, vouched for the authenticity of her documents, and a hearing was set for the first Saturday in June. The night before the hearing, Clara could not sleep. She sat once more at the altar, the medallion in her hand, and thought of her father's stone walls, built slow and patient, while faster men mocked his pace, only to watch those same fast walls crumble in the first hard winter, while his still stood. She thought of her mother's mending, of small broken things nursed carefully back into use, while others called it wasted effort. And she thought, for the first time in months, not of what had been taken from her, but of what she still had the power to give. She was not merely reclaiming water rights, she realized. She was restoring the very thing Father Marcos and Elias Reyes, her own distant kin, it turned out, threaded improbably through this desert story, had tried to build in the first place, a town that took care of itself, together, rather than one man profiting from what belonged to all. The hearing itself, held in the schoolhouse, with nearly the whole town crowded onto benches meant for children, was a tense and crowded affair. Otis Pruitt arrived with his lawyer and his brothers, confident and dismissive, prepared to argue that whatever old paper a widow had dug out of a ruin held no legal weight against 15 years of established use and improvement. But when Clara rose and read Father Marcos's covenant aloud, in the clear, steady voice her mother had taught her to use for hard truths, and when Julius Farrow confirmed the survey map's authenticity before the assembled council, something shifted in the room, a recognition, slow and then sudden, among ranchers and farmers who had quietly resented the Pruitt water fee for years, but never had the paper to challenge it. One by one, neighbors who had barely spoken to Clara in the weeks since Otis's visit began to speak up in her favor. Old Mrs. Alderman, whose husband had paid the Pruitt fee every summer of their marriage. Young Tomas Herrera, whose family farm had nearly failed the year the fee doubled. Even Chester Bramwell, the auctioneer, standing to say plainly that he had sold that chapel for $6, never imagining it held the answer to a fight the whole basin had been too tired to start. The council's ruling, delivered a week later, after consultation with the Territorial Land Office, was not a swift or total victory. These things rarely are. But it restored the spring to the chapel's trust, exactly as Father Marcos had intended. Established a modest, community-administered fee, sufficient only to maintain the well's upkeep, and ended, once and for all, the Pruitt family's private profit from water that had never been rightfully theirs alone to sell. Otis Pruitt did not go to prison, and he kept his ranch and his herds, but he lost, in a single afternoon, the quiet leverage he had held over every family in the basin for 15 years. And something in the way the townsfolk looked at him afterward, no longer with deference, but with the plain, unimpressed clarity of people who finally understood what he had taken from them, proved a harder punishment than any judge could have handed down. Silas Doyle, watching his powerful ally humbled, found his own bullying reputation quietly diminished as well. When Clara later petitioned to have her original homestead claim reviewed, under the new scrutiny the town now gave to old, convenient family agreements, several neighbors, who had once stayed silent, came forward to testify on her behalf. And though the land itself was never returned to her, Silas found himself, for the first time in his life, held accountable in the court of his neighbor's opinion, a currency he had always relied on and never expected to lose. Clara Doyle had come to Ashwater Basin with $14 and a chapel no one wanted, mocked by men who told her, laughing, to take it home. She had not known, kneeling in the dust that first evening, that the walls around her held not gold, but something rarer, a promise kept faithfully by strangers 2 generations gone, waiting only for someone stubborn enough, patient enough, unwilling enough, to see worthlessness where there was only a thing not yet finished, to carry it the rest of the way. She thought often, in the years that followed, of her father's stone walls and her mother's careful mending, of the particular gift Daniel had once teased her for, the ear that could hear a small voice inside a broken thing saying, "Not yet, not yet, I am not finished," and understood now that it was never simply a gift for fixing saddles or reviving wells. It was the gift of refusing to let a covenant die merely because the people who made it were gone, and of understanding that what looks like nothing to a laughing crowd may be, to the patient hand that claims it, an inheritance large enough to restore an entire town. Clara repaired the chapel roof herself that autumn, with lumber the town now gladly supplied, and though she never reconsecrated it as a house of worship in any formal sense, She kept its doors open to any traveler who needed water or shelter, exactly as Father Marcos and Elias Reyes had intended, exactly as the covenant beneath its altar had promised. She wore the silver medallion on a cord around her neck for the rest of her days, a small dove catching the desert light, a reminder that the spring of life, once forgotten, had only ever been waiting to be found by someone who still believed it was worth the trouble. We hope Clara's story reminded you that value is rarely loud and rarely obvious to those in a hurry to mock it. If you've ever held on to something others were quick to write off, we would love to know what you found there, or what you're still hoping to uncover. And we leave you with this question to carry with you. What is a time you found real value in something the world had already thrown away? Thank you for spending this time with us, and for letting Clara's small, stubborn miracle become part of your evening. If her story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that overlooked things are not always worthless things. Until next time, stay close.